Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, one news development reported in many different ways.
اتهامهم برفض استئناف المفاوضات.
The neighborhood of Gilo.
The story of Gilo and the unsettling news of a growing Israeli settlement. A bloodbath in the Philippines.
Bullet-ridden bodies were discovered hours later.
Journalists murdered. The chilling effect of British libel laws on freedom of the press around the world.
You're bankrupted the moment somebody decides to take you on.
And going rogue on the ex-governor of Alaska. Sarah Palin takes a beating on the American airwaves.
It seems that Sarah Palin has a book, Going Rogue, okay? It's also available 30% off.
In any other country, any other territory, the approval for building 900 new housing units would be seen as a routine piece of municipal administrative paperwork, not a news story. However, when the municipality involved is Jerusalem and the land the Israelis are building on is Palestinian, those housing units become an illegal settlement and they make headlines. That particular stroke of an Israeli administrator's pen has been interpreted by the global news media as a very public rebuff by the Netanyahu government of the Obama administration's efforts to restart peace talks between Israel and Palestine. And it put the international media spotlight on a place called Gilo, which most news outlets call a settlement, but others, primarily Israeli and American, say is just a disputed neighborhood. Our starting point this week is Jerusalem. We look at the coverage and the terminology of a story that's controversial to the core.
30,000 people already live here in Gilo. Israel is building new homes and says it will continue to do so.
Tuesday's announcement of almost 900 new homes in East Jerusalem has the Obama administration calling foul again.
American coverage focused on the duel between Obama and Netanyahu. Who will flinch first?
The president has to get Netanyahu to go along to get along.
Television is quick. Television is often facile.
Are we supposed to be friends with Syria? Are we supposed to be friends with Iran?
The debates about this issue,
Hezbollah, Hamas,
tend to be very ideological, very strident, very brief.
Israel has really created a language to legitimize the occupation.
For a freeze on construction.
And this language is used across the board.
For the media in the Arab world, the settlements issue was always going to be one of the acid tests of the Obama administration's approach to the Middle East. Back in June, during his speech in Cairo, the president deployed some lofty rhetoric.
The legitimate Palestinian aspiration for dignity, opportunity, and a state of their own.
But that rhetoric was demolished when Palestinian homes were taken down in East Jerusalem.
The Israeli government's recent approval of the construction of 900 new housing units in Gilo, a Jewish neighborhood built on lands captured by Israel in 1967, did not shock anyone in the Middle East and certainly not the Arab media. Pundits in the Arab world had a field day tracking early Obama's statements about the settlement freeze and comparing them to the backpedaling that happened later on.
The Arab media and generally the Arab street believes that the Israeli lobby is too strong, and even if Obama genuinely wants peace based on two-state solution, the removal of settlements, or at least for the time being freezing the settlements, his hands are actually tied.
From the point of view of the Arab press, until they see some actual constraints being placed on Israel by the United States, it's likely they're going to continue to be very skeptical that this is anything other than kalam fadi.
Additional settlement building does not contribute to Israel's security.
Empty words.
The words and images the Israeli media are using to tell the Gilo story are varied.
Units in the Gilo neighborhood of Jerusalem.
There is a wide spectrum of opinions in Israeli press. What we've seen is the media concentrating on the political fallout of this expansion. What will it mean in terms of Mahmoud Abbas's position within the Palestinian Authority? And especially now, what does this mean in terms of the Israeli government and the new US administration? Rather than a questioning of these settlements, their legitimacy, and what they actually mean for the larger peace deal on the table.
Haaretz, the biggest paper on the Israeli left, said of the settlement policy, first we shape a new reality for ourselves, then we expect the entire world to adopt it, demand that our neighbors pay the cost, and complain that we have no partner for peace. But Yediat Aharonot, Israel's most widely read paper, argued, we and only we are entitled to decide where we build, and what will happen in our sovereign state. America is a good friend, and it will remain such, Mr. President, even if, once in a while, we have to put it in its place.
Hezbollah does not want peace with Israel.
Sometimes Israel, or at least its powerful overseas lobby, put the media in their place. 8 years ago, pro-Israeli groups successfully lobbied CNN to stop calling Gilo a settlement and refer to it instead as a neighborhood.
Settlement is more emotive, more loaded, but you mean if it's a settlement, it reminds people of colonialism, it reminds people of occupation. Neighborhood is a place where people live.
Israel has been creating this language of its own in which to justify the actions of the occupation. And in fact, Israel gets upset when the foreign press and its own press doesn't use its dictionary, if you like, to describe what's happening in Israel.
The number of settlers is higher than ever before.
Some U.S. networks like ABC and CBS still call Gilo what it is, a settlement. However, the New York Times used settlement in the headline, but the story itself called Gilo a neighborhood, an area, a district, anything but a settlement. And the Times is the most influential newspaper in America and probably the world.
They choose a word that no one will object to, they hope. It's because of fear that Israel's so-called friends abroad will condemn them personally or their news organizations if they use words which are nearer to the truth. We're not talking about neighborhoods, we're talking about colonies being built for Jews and Jews only, illegally on Arab land. So by using these timorous, frightened words that journalists do, we diminish the Palestinian suffering. And we go on using this because we want to avoid controversy, quote unquote.
But look at the historical fact.
And controversies require explanations, which take time. And there's not much of that available, especially on ratings-driven television in markets that matter, like the U.S.
Television, generally speaking, doesn't explain that this is a foreign military occupation, that the Israelis are occupiers, that the settlements are not neighborhoods but colonies built on land seized from Palestinians. This is not something that gets conveyed very frequently to the American audience.
So what is the answer for television reporters? Keep it down. Don't put controversial things on television, because you will be accused, shamefully, outrageously, slanderously, of being anti-Semitic if you dare to criticize Israel.
Gilo is just one small settlement, but the news coverage makes Gilo a microcosm of the way the media handle the Palestine-Israel conflict. Competing narratives, differing terminology,
neighborhood of Gilo,
pressure from the pro-Israel lobby. They all come with the territory, even when the story is Israel building on Palestinian territory in East Jerusalem. Here's how our Global Village voices see the coverage of the Gilo story.
The Obama administration, like all those before it, plays with words. We may hear new language like settlement freeze or dismay over increased ethnic cleansing in Jerusalem, but no actions. The media in Israel feigns U.S. rhetoric is too harsh. In Arab media, there's outrage. Only rarely does one find solutions.
Certainly the activist media in Israel is covering the new settlements in East Jerusalem, just like they've covered all the old settlements in East Jerusalem and everything else that's happening in the occupied territories. But it doesn't matter, because the government does what it wants, and the majority of Israelis either don't care, are invested in the settlement program and that project in some sense, or feel completely hopeless and don't know what to do.
We've now got almost 3,500 viewers following us on Facebook and Twitter. They use those sites to find out what stories we're working on in case they want to weigh in as one of our Global Village voices. You can do the same. Or you can just get in touch with us via email. We're waiting to hear from you at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. Our News Bite section this week is heavy with media news from Southeast Asia.
Monday's mass killings are seen as unprecedented.
At least 26 journalists have been killed in the Philippines in what has been called one of the bloodiest days in the history of the news media.
Bullet-ridden bodies were discovered hours later.
The reporters were caught up in a massacre in which more than 30 other people were murdered. The journalists were part of a convoy following a local politician on the island of Mindanao when they were captured and then slaughtered by a gang of gunmen. The New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists had this to say: "Covering the news has always been dangerous in the Philippines, but the wanton killing of so many people makes this an assault on the very fabric of the country's democracy. We welcome President Arroyo's promise to investigate and prosecute the perpetrators of this terrible violence." A Chinese blogger who criticized the government's relief efforts after the Sichuan earthquake in 2008 has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. Wan Chi was detained within a month of the quake for posting articles on his site that said food aid was not being delivered properly because relief agencies had to go through government channels, which Chinese people tend to distrust because of past corruption scandals. Wan's lawyer said the blogger got the maximum sentence for, quote, illegally holding secret state documents, unquote. Officials say they found 2 municipal government documents in Wan's house. Wan Chi has already spent 5 years in jail after posting articles about the Tiananmen Square crackdown that were written by exiled Chinese dissidents. The Paris-based media freedom group Reporters Without Borders is providing $380,000 in funding to 3 South Korean radio stations that target listeners across the border in North Korea. The stations, Open Radio for North Korea, Free North Korea Radio, and Radio Free Chosun, all have an anti-Pyongyang slant and transmit via shortwave. The government in Pyongyang has demanded in the past that South Korea suspend the stations, since radio is a key medium for North Korean citizens to receive information that has not been vetted or sanitized by their government. British investigators in Lebanon say they have found the remains of Alec Collett, a journalist kidnapped 24 years ago, who was described as the forgotten hostage. A group led by Palestinian militant Abu Nidal abducted Collett in 1985 while he was on assignment for the United Nations. The UN tried on 3 separate occasions to find Collett's remains, since he was one of few hostages whose fate was never determined. Collett was one of 80 foreigners kidnapped in Lebanon, many of them journalists, between 1984 and 1991. Those shrinking newsrooms that blame the internet for their falling revenues are getting a helping hand from YouTube. The video sharing site launched a new application this past week called YouTube Direct. This new tool will take news editors directly to videos and still photographs shot by amateurs, so-called citizen journalists, of news events such as natural disasters or political protests that those news editors could then use for their broadcasts or publications.
That way, you can rebroadcast the best footage on your network or website.
News organizations are already using YouTube and social networking sites for some content. This new application will make it easier for them to find that content, but it probably won't stop news outlets from blaming YouTube and its owner Google for siphoning off much of their revenues. We're back after the break with a look at Britain, the favored destination for anyone with a libel case to fight.